Hey guys, in this video we're going to be going through the installation of these flush mount headlights that I designed for the Pontiac Fiero. These headlights here eliminate the pop-up headlights that you find on a stock Fiero, and that eliminates the problems that come along with those pop-up headlights. Now normally with pop-up headlights, you get issues like stripped motor gears, the motors themselves burning out, and then of course after so many years after the production of the vehicle, these headlight parts are oftentimes hard to find. So in addition to the newer projector technology, which will give you a much improved light output with that nice sharp cutoff line, you also now have an aerodynamic advantage as the pop-up headlights are essentially air brakes when they're deployed, and you have the advantage of lighter weight assemblies. So these things weigh less than the stock headlights, and in addition to that, they use a lot of universal retrofit parts. And so what that means is that you will no longer have any sort of issue sourcing parts for your headlights if something fails. And so this video covers the pre-assembly and installation of these lights onto your vehicle. Unfortunately, I've been through many design iterations of these particular lights and I no longer have my stock headlights, they're long gone. So I can't show you on video the removal process for the stock headlights, but if you do purchase these lights here, they do come with written instructions with pictures that detail the removal of the stock headlight system. And it's very easy, so you have nothing to worry about there. And so as I just mentioned, I've gone through several iterations of design. This is the third revision of these lights, and it is definitely the latest and greatest with a lot of changes here. So these lenses now on top are made of poly-carbonate, which is the same material that OEM headlights on any other car are made from. Previously, they were made from PETG, which was more than up to the task for this application, but now this is the real deal. The buckets, or the housings as I like to call them, these guys here are now made of ABS PC. So previously they were sheet metal and I would bend them and form them and weld them. The only problem with that, although they were good quality, was that there were some holes and they were essentially not all that watertight. Never had any issues with them at all, but this provides us with a better seal overall. And these guys here were designed in CAD with a 3D scanner, so I was able to actually scan the hood of the vehicle, and I was able to get a really, really high accuracy fit. So the fit on these guys is vastly improved. All of the curves and all of the features here fit so perfectly inside that headlight housing. I'm very, very proud of this design. In addition to that, all the brackets are now made out of aluminum. Previously they were steel, so there's some weight savings there. And lastly, the interior features here, which allow you to mount these projector lights, now have a new aiming feature, which is so much easier to use and it's so much more intuitive. And so that's another huge improvement for this third version. It's really almost a ground up redesign. The one thing I wanted to do though, however, was I wanted to make the lenses backwards compatible. So if you do own a previous version of these lights, and you need replacement lenses, I'm happy to say that these new lenses will fit on your old assemblies here. So the mounting points actually remain the same, and that was one requirement that I really didn't want to have to modify because I want to support any sort of person who has the older version of these lights and everything is backwards compatible with the lenses. And so one last thing to mention here before we move on to the pre-assembly is that these lenses that I'm showing you right now are not painted, so you can see inside of the entire housing. When you guys do this assembly, and we'll get to that step later on, there'll be a point at which you paint the inside of these lenses so you cannot see the bulbs and all of the bracketry and everything behind the front face of the projector. And that's obviously gonna make things a lot more visually appealing, but for this demonstration of just showing you what's new and what's improved, I left them clear so you can see all of that in there. So before we even start wrenching on the vehicle, there's a little bit of pre-assembly that we can do. Your kit comes with 4 projectors, 2 for the driver's side, 2 for the passenger side, and each side of the vehicle has its own mounting bracket. So there is a driver's side bracket and a passenger side bracket, and they are not interchangeable with one another as they are mirror images of one another. The projectors install on the front side of the bracket, and you can tell which is the front and the back because there is an adjuster screw already pre-installed onto your bracket, and the adjuster is always on the back of the bracket. and it's also on the bottom side. So when you install these things into your vehicle, eventually that adjuster will be on the bottom. When the projectors get installed onto the bracket, you have to also pay attention because there's a top side and a bottom side to the projector. So on the bottom of the projector, there is a little solenoid here which controls your high beam and low beam. That will be on the same side as that adjuster, so it's on the bottom. Now I've gone ahead and I've installed my projectors onto these brackets without the shrouds pre-mounted to the projector itself. I've done it this way because I'm going to be using some custom shrouds, and the second reason I've done it this way is because I'm going to go through this assembly here without the shrouds installed so you can see what's going on. It's a little easier to see without something in the way. For you guys, you will be installing your shrouds, which will look something like this here. You'll be installing them onto the projectors before you mount them onto the brackets, and we'll get to that mounting in a second. But first, you can take a look at the back of the shroud. There's 4 mounting points. Those 4 mounting points will line up with the mounting points on the back of each projector. And so there's 4 holes included in your kit. There are 4 of these little screws for each projector, and you just simply screw them into the back of the shroud through your projector, and it'll secure the 2 together. So to install your projectors onto the brackets, it's pretty straightforward. Looking at the back of the projector, you'll see that there's a little bracket here, and this is the bulb retainer. There is a nut here that when you start to unscrew it on the back of the projector, it will eventually run into this bulb retainer and you cannot get this nut off. In order to remove the nut to install it onto these brackets here, there are 3 small screws on the bulb retainer that you'll have to remove, and the bulb retainer will just come off, and it looks something like this here. When the bulb retainer is removed, you can unthread the nut completely and you're left with the threaded shaft on the back of the projector. And so before you slide the threaded shaft through your bracket, you want to take your large silicone washer, each projector comes with one, and you're going to slip it over top of the shaft. There's a side of the washer that conforms to the body of the projector, and you're going to want to mate those 2 surfaces together, and it's going to look something like this here. So you have your projector inserted through your bracket, the large silicone washer is on the same side as the projector body, and on the other side here I have my nuts installed. The nuts are quite large, and it's unlikely that you'll have a wrench of this size. I believe it's 1/16 of an inch in Imperial. And these guys here can be just tightened down with a adjustable wrench. Now you don't want to go too crazy and tighten them too tight, but you don't want them too loose that there's too much slop and the projector can rotate too easily. The silicone washers give the whole thing a little bit more grip when you do tighten them down, and you should still be able to rotate them if you force them enough by hand, but you don't want them to be able to, like I said, rotate freely and then lose alignment later on when we go to aim them. Now, after you have your nuts tightened down, this is what it should look like. You're gonna take your bulb retainer, you're gonna install those 3 screws again, and then you can insert your HID bulb into the back of the projector. So if you've never inserted an HID bulb into the back of a projector, it's pretty straightforward. You have a bulb here, and you definitely don't want to touch the bulb with your bare hands. You don't want oils from your hands transferring onto the bulb. You can actually burn them out this way when you go to turn them on later. So wear gloves if you do have to touch that. There is this little piece here on the bottom of the bulb that if you look at the opening of the back of a projector, it slides in to that little slot. And so I don't have a bulb retainer on this side here, but if I did, like on this side, you can see that there's this little wire retainer, and it slips into the top 2 holes here, and it goes around the body of the bulb. And then there's 2 little clasps on the bottom side that you just push down and push in, and it will clasp and push the bulb down and retain it into place. It may be a little bit difficult to see on camera here, but it will all make sense when you see it in person. It's pretty straightforward. And so your assemblies should look something like this with a few minor exceptions. The first exception being that your shrouds should already be installed, like I had previously mentioned, And the second exception is that you may have 4 bulbs installed. You'll notice that I only have 2 bulbs installed. So I have them installed on the inner projectors, and you can tell which ones are the inner projectors by looking at the top of the bracket. The bracket has a little step in it, and the projectors being installed on the front side of the bracket, the inner projectors are more forward facing than the outer projectors. And so in my particular case, I'm choosing to run only 2 projectors, the inner ones. The outer projectors are going to be used as daytime running lights with something called demonized. And demonized are just little accent lighting that install inside of the projectors. They're LEDs. Some of them are RGB and they can change colors. Some of them are just single colors. The point being is that I'm running 2 projectors, and some of you guys will choose to run all 4. I live in a larger city, and I find that the street lighting outside in the city supplements the headlights well enough that I only need to run 2 projectors. With 4 projectors, it's extremely bright, and you will not blind on oncoming drivers because there are the proper cutoff shields inside of these projectors. So you don't have to worry about that if you want to run all 4 projectors. But like I said, for my case, I'm running 2, and so I have 2 bulbs installed. On the one side here, you can see the bulb terminations are these little amp connectors. And through the grommet that comes with most HID bulb kits, I've also pushed through the 2 wire leads here for the projector solenoid. And so the solenoids, which are on the bottom of the projectors, they have a positive and negative lead that activate those solenoids. And this is what gives you your high beam function. So your bulb itself stays on all of the time, and it's just a little shield inside of the projector that gives you low beam and high beam function. And so most of these generic universal HID bulbs have this rubber grommet already attached to the bulb leads, and there's 2 extra holes, and they're exactly for this purpose. They're for you to push through your leads for your solenoid shield. So again, there's a positive and negative. On this side, you can see that I have not done it yet. And so you'll see the 2 empty holes there where I can push these leads through. And so getting the leads through the grommet is actually pretty easy. One little tip here is that you should first remove these little red rubber-like seals before pushing your blades through. And so after that's done, you can just simply find the hole on the back side here and start pushing it through until you see it start to poke through, and then grab a pair of pliers and just pull them through gently. You don't have to squeeze too hard, and definitely just squeeze on the end of the contact. Don't squeeze down here where there's little features here that actually retain the contact in the housing afterwards. And then you can do the other side. And once you've pulled your contacts through, now you can take your little seals and put them back on top of your contacts where they belong. And so now that you have your contacts on the other side of your grommet, you can take your plug housing and we can install these contacts into the housing. At this point, you also have to get your wiring harness out before you install your contacts in there, because you have to make sure on the mating plug that you line up your positive and negative correctly. The plugs have little nubs here, little retaining features that snap into the mating plug. And so there is polarity. There is a positive and there is a negative side that you have to pay attention to. I do not include the wiring harness with these kits because there are many different wiring harnesses out there at many different price points and levels of quality. So it's up to you how much you want to spend on your wiring harness. But essentially the wiring harness is just a fancy relay that leaves the bulb on at all times. And when you flip your high beams on in your car, it provides power to the solenoid here, which activates the solenoid shield and gives you your high beam function. And so once you have your polarity figured out, you can take a look at your contacts. One side is blank without too many features on it. The other side sort of has an open face to it. The open face is going to face the inside of the plug. And so in my particular case, when looking at it in this direction, my positive wire goes on this side. And so I take that open face, I face it towards the inside of the plug, and I start to push it through. You may have to take a set of needle nose pliers, and again, you might have to actually pull it through, because the wire may not be stiff enough. But once you pull it, it does click into place. And if you give it a light tug on the back, you should not be able to pull that contact back out. The click may not be very loud or very evident, but you'll know it's securely in place when you can't pull that wire out. Just don't pull too hard. Once your contact is in place, you can take your little rubber grommet on the back side, and you can also push that into the hole to provide some level of waterproofing. So now I'm going to be demonstrating the rest of the assembly on this driver's side unit. And if you just take a look at the shape of the bucket and you compare it to your headlight door, you'll be able to discern which side is which. And so this is the driver's side. On the back of the bucket, there is the driver's side bracket installed. And in the same way that the projector brackets are not interchangeable, the mounting brackets are not interchangeable either. They are mirror images of one another. So to figure out which one is which, just line them up with the mounting holes, and you'll see these large holes where we're going to pass through our bulbs and other connectors. The little angled cutout on the bottom of this bracket will not interfere with these holes. If you have it on the wrong side, the angle will be facing the wrong way, and likely it's going to encroach on these holes here. So that's how you can tell which side is which. These brackets get installed with 2 hex nuts, 2 washers, and 2 flange nuts. Now, I've taken the flange nuts and I've placed them on the inside of the bucket, and throughout the rest of this assembly, we're going to be doing the same sort of thing here. So the flange nut has small serrations on the underside of the face. Those serrations will easily bite into the plastic buckets, so they're designed to go and mate with the plastic. Don't put the flange nuts on the sides of the brackets that are aluminum, as they will not likely bite into the aluminum as well as they will bite into the plastic, and that feature is going to help those from coming loose in the future. With the rear mounting bracket now installed hand tight, we can take 4 more of our nuts, bolts, and washers, and we're going to be using those to secure our projector assembly inside of the bucket with the mounting holes on either side. Now, before you can even slip this thing in, you may have to do a little bit of finesse work here and slide your connectors through your holes at the back of the bucket before you can actually get this thing to sit in there properly so you can line up your holes. And the other thing that might be in the way is that adjuster screw on the bottom. You may have to thread that out towards the front of the vehicle a little bit more in order to get the mounting holes on the side lined up. Otherwise, that adjuster screw may already be hitting the back wall of your bucket, preventing you from getting those holes lined up. Once you have things roughly lined up inside the bucket, you can lift up your brackets, and I like to get the top bolts in first. They're usually easier, and so you can just push them in by hand. Again, I have the bolt heads on the inside of the bucket, and I'm going to have my flange nuts on the outside of the bucket. So you're going to screw those on by hand, and they should just spin into place, and you don't want to go any tighter right now than just finger tight. So at this point here, you can see that the projector assembly rotates about those top 2 screws. And now it's a little trickier to get these ones in on the bottom. And the trick that I like to use is I like to grab some needle nose pliers and grab the head of the bolt, tilt the bucket up so gravity helps you out a little bit. And you're gonna have to use a little bit of finesse again here, but you can just slip those in, and once the bolt is in place, hold it with your finger on the inside, and on the outside, you can just thread the nut on. And you can do the same for the other side, tilting this bucket up the other way while you slip this one in. So now with all 4 bolts in place, and again, they're only hand tight, you can see that the assembly here can still rotate about those top 2 bolts. The last thing we need to do here is we need to get this little adjuster foot, as I like to call it, in place. So if you flip the bucket up, you can see the adjustment screw, and it should not be touching the back wall of this bucket. There should be maybe about 1/4 of an inch of a gap in there. And the idea here is that you can take your adjuster screw, foot, and you can just slip it between the wall of the bucket and the headlight projector assembly, and you can actually just use your hand to rotate the assembly back and pinch that foot between the screw and the wall. Now you can take your screwdriver on the front side. I'm gonna have to flip this around a little bit here so I can work on it, and just thread that adjuster in until that foot is securely pinched between the wall and the screw. And now it's in there and it won't come out. And so the idea behind this little assembly here is that the projectors naturally want to rotate downwards because of gravity, and that little adjuster screw with that foot is going to prevent it from rotating down. And by threading in and out the screw, you can essentially allow the projectors to drop or raise. And so I just want to reiterate at this point how important it is that these projector mounting bolts on the side are only hand tight. And the reason for that is that if you go to make any sort of adjustments on your adjustment screw and these bolts are tight, that adjustment screw is essentially going to be trying to bend this bracket about the middle point here. As long as they're loose, the thing can rotate about these two top bolts, and that'll prevent the bracket from getting bent. So please do not over tighten these at this point, it's not necessary. And so one of the last preparation steps here is to install our seal on the upper flange of our headlight buckets. And so the seal that's included with your kit is this cork-like material, and it has an adhesive backing on one side. And you're gonna wanna take note of how I installed this. And so on the back edge of this flange, the seal has been pushed right to the outer edge. On the two side flanges, the seal has been pushed to the outer edge. And on the front edge of our flange, the seal is actually biased more towards the inside of the bucket. So you have two countersunk mounting holes that you'll be able to see in the bucket here on the front edge. And we don't want that seal interfering so much with those countersunk holes. So again, I pushed it away. Now it's not so far inside that it's riding along the rounded edge. It's still sitting on the flat portion of this flange, but again, it's more towards the inside of this bucket. And so just a few notes about installing the seal. It's actually pretty straightforward. The seal can bend a little bit around curves. This curve is a lot easier to do than this curve here. If you are bending it around, you will have to make a few little triangular slices. Otherwise, you can just cut straight edges like I've done here, and then do the best you can to fit the adjacent piece beside it and run it along the next edge. I tried to get a little fancy here with the bend, but like I said, you can use straight cuts if you wish. The other thing to take note of here is that this stuff is very easy to cut with a hobby knife or a razor blade. So you can make nice smooth cuts with something just very sharp, very easy to work with. And the other thing is the holes here on the side flanges that are meant for mounting the lenses later on. These have to be cleared out because the seal will interfere with them a little bit. And it's very easy to drill through that. You don't even have to use an actual power tool to do it. You can just take a drill bit in your fingers and you can work your way through the material with a sharp drill bit with just your fingers. And that's gonna prevent you from damaging the actual plastic buckets or accidentally drilling additional holes in them. At this point, your seals are now installed and your assembly should look something like this. I've installed my shrouds, and like I mentioned at the beginning of this instructional video, your shrouds will have been installed right from the start and they'll look something like this. Mine I've color matched to my car. You can take these shrouds and before doing any of this assembly, you can color match them to your car or paint them any particular color you want as a cool accent color inside your headlight. So now we're in the garage. You can see that I have the stock headlight removed. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the stock units have been removed for quite some time now and I don't have them any longer. So unfortunately, I can't show you guys how to remove them from your vehicle, but the included instructions with the kit will show you step by step how to remove those, and it's not a bad process at all. But so we're left with this opening with the headlight door gone, and we're ready to fit in our new assemblies. And so at this point, you guys may also be wondering, what's with that awesome looking hood vent there? Well, this is a hood vent that I designed for the Fiero, and it is intended to extract high pressure and heat from your radiator, but mainly high pressure at high speeds, because the Fiero is plagued with a problem with a light steering feel at high speeds. Pressure builds up in this radiator zone here, has nowhere to go. Sometimes you see the headlights actually pop up when you had the original pop-up headlights, and that sort of alleviates some of the pressure at high speeds. But this vent is designed to do that so you don't have flappy headlights in the wind, which looks pretty bad if you ask me. But this guy is listed on my website as a universal fit. I did design it to fit the Fiero really, really nicely, but you can get it to fit pretty much any other car. So if you are watching this video and you do have a different vehicle, take a look at my website. Link is in the video description and you can find those guys there. Now back to the headlight installation. So getting our assembly into the headlight opening is actually pretty straightforward. We already pre-assembled everything early in the video. I'm gonna bring it behind the hood. And as you can see, I have the hood in the flipped up position. I'm just gonna bring it through the headlight opening in this direction here. And then there's that little landing or little flange here on the actual hood where I can rest the bucket. And that rear bracket is gonna butt up right against the back side of the hood. When you guys did the removal of your stock headlights, there were these two 10mm hex bolts here that were holding in the headlight door. We're gonna be reusing these guys here. And in the written instructions where I tell you guys how to remove the stock headlights, I do mention saving these. So it's very important that you do save these because we're gonna be reusing them. And I'm just gonna thread them in by hand. You can now let go of the assembly and it will sit in there pretty comfortably. Now the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna take these little nylon spacers, there's two of them here, and we are going to just lightly push up on the assembly. And I'm gonna reach in behind the hood and I'm gonna slip these between the landing on the hood and the underside of this flange here. And they're gonna line up with the two mounting holes on the front edge. And after this, we're gonna go get some of our flathead machine screws and we're gonna fasten them down. And so now we have our flathead machine screws in place. They pass through the nylon spacers and they pass through the hood. On the bottom side, I've hand threaded on some 832 nylock nuts, which are all included in the kit. I'm gonna grab my hex key here on the top side, hold this still, and on the bottom, I'm gonna tighten things down with a little ratchet. This guy is a little bit overkill, but I'm gonna be careful not to over tighten them. This is actually certainly overkill. Be very careful not to over tighten them as you could actually crack your hood, which you definitely don't wanna do. So with the front two bolts now tightened down, we can go to the back side and we can tighten down those 10mm hex bolts that we kept from the original assembly. And so now the only thing left to do is to tighten down these two bolts here. But before we do that, you can see that I'm able to move the housing up and down. And what I'm doing is adjusting the depth of the back edge of this housing. So I can actually adjust the uniformity of how the lens sits with respect to the hood. So these new buckets are formed to conform to all of the curves of this hood. And so I can get this sitting nice and flush and perfect with the hood once the lens is on. So you can actually take your lens, place it on top, and sort of figure out where you want this back edge to sit. And then we can tighten these two rear bolts down. When tightening these bolts, we're gonna be treating them the same way that we did with the projector bolts that's holding the projector bracket here. So we're gonna be taking our wrench and we're gonna be holding the nuts, those flange nuts with the serrated face on it. We're gonna be holding them still. And on the back side where the bolt and washer is contacting the aluminum, that is where we are going to be turning. So again, hold the nut side still so those serrations can bite into the plastic. So this is what the passenger side looks like with the hood lowered. Don't mind the dust on the vehicle, it's been a long winter, but we can slip on our cover and we can see that we have a nice uniform fit. And around the entire headlight opening, and things are looking good up until this point. And with the hood flipped up, this is what the back of the installation looks like. So before we go any further, you actually have to aim these lights. Now, in order to aim the lights, you have to have working lights. And in order to have working lights, that means you have to have the electrical portion of this build done. I am not going to go into extreme depth about the electrical and the wiring in this video because there are a lot of ways to accomplish wiring these lights. And I actually get the most questions about these kits, about the wiring and about the wiring harness and about bulb and ballast selection. So we are going to have a little bit of a chit chat about that right now. But it's not going to be too in-depth because it really comes down to a few factors like, are you running 2 lights or 4 lights? How much money do you want to spend? Where you want to get your stuff from? And so one of the first things that I always tell people is that with these kits, the reason that I don't include a harness and the reason I don't include bulbs or ballast is that because there's so many options out there. There's just an insane number of harnesses. There's an insane number of bulbs and ballasts at so many different price points and levels of quality that I just can't make everybody happy with one selection. And the thing about the bulbs and ballasts are that for me personally, I find that I don't drive this vehicle every day. If I did, I would invest in probably a higher quality bulb and ballast kit. But for myself, this is sort of a leisure vehicle and it's something that I use pretty infrequently. So I can get away with a little bit of a cheaper bulb and ballast, and that's where I sort of save money. Everybody has a budget and a price point to work with. So that's kind of where I decided to make my cut, and I'm perfectly fine with that. I've purchased expensive bulbs and expensive ballasts in the past for my everyday vehicles, and the light output is a little bit better than, let's say, a cheap eBay kit. But the cheap eBay kit is the right price, and if you are running, 4 headlights in this situation here, in this setup, then it's pretty hard to swallow the bill when you're purchasing, $150 or $200 retrofit kits with bulbs and ballasts. It's a lot of money. It starts to add up. And so sometimes those cheap eBay kits are just the right price and just what you need for this build. And so I'm not going to steer you away from using those cheap kits. Like I said, I've used them in my builds in the past, and they are actually a lot better than the stock headlight setup anyway to begin with. So you're already getting better performance out of even eBay HID kits. The only thing with this particular headlight setup is that you do not want to use anything more than a 35 watt HID kit. So these projectors take H1 size bulbs, and you're really looking for 35 watt kits. Do not use the 55 watt kits. They burn much too hot, especially if you put 2 kits inside of one of these housings. The Fiero headlight housings aren't all that big, so you don't want to be pumping in, over 100 watts of heat into this little space. 35 watt kits are more than adequate, especially when you have 4 headlights, and they'll do the trick. The new lenses are made out of poly-carbonate, so there's less of a chance of those things melting, but I still would not go more than 35 watts. And not even just the lenses, but the actual projectors themselves, it's not recommended with these tiny projectors. They're only 2.5 inches. It's not recommended that you go with a 55 watt kit. It may even be too much just for the projector, never mind the housing or the lens. So 35 watt kits. The bulb temperature is the color of the bulb. Now, for me personally, I don't like, purple headlights or green headlights. If that's your thing, great, go for it. But the light output is extremely poor. You want to sort of fall, I think, within that 4,000 to 6,000 K. 4,000, you're getting a little more yellowish. 5,000, whitish. 6,000 K, it's whitish blue. Anything beyond that, 8,000, you're starting to get into more of a really blue headlight. And you might get some trouble with cops, but you also are losing out on light output. For me, 6,000 K or even 5,500, it's perfect. It's like that nice diamond white with just a little tiny little bit of like a cool blue tinge to it, which I personally like. Some people like the warmer, 4,000 K. So that's that. Now when it comes to the wiring harness, this is another area where there's a lot of options, but you are looking for one thing specifically. You're looking for a wiring harness that is a Bi-Xenon controller. So these headlights here or the projectors rather, are Bi-Xenon. And what that means is that you're using a single bulb and that bulb stays on all the time. But what's giving you the functionality of low beam and high beam is not the bulb, it's the solenoid inside of the projector. So there's a little shield, and when these things are disassembled, you can clearly see it. There's a little shield that flips up and down with a little solenoid that's electronically activated. That solenoid is what provides you with your cutoff pattern that these HID projectors are famous for. When you flip your high beams on, the solenoid is activated and the shield comes down and gives you that big dispersion pattern that, you know, a high beam you would expect from a high beam. So you no longer have that cutoff line. Now, your wiring harness keeps the bulb on at all times. So in a car like a Fiero, the original H4 headlight had two filaments. And so it had a low beam and a high beam filament. And they were positioned, I think, differently. And inside of a reflector housing, it was when the high beam filament came on, I believe the position of it just sort of changed that output pattern through the reflector. Now, in this case, like I said, it's the harness that's going to be keeping your single filament, it's not even a filament really, it's a xenon gas that's being ignited here, but it's keeping that on at all times. Now, it's the projector, like I said, that is activating your high beam, and in order to activate that high beam, you're using the high beam signal from your stock wiring harness, and that's interfacing with the new harness that you're putting in here, that Bi-Xenon controller. So the controller keeps the low beam on at all times, even though the car is actually telling it to turn off. It maintains power to that bulb, it stays on, and when the high beam is flipped on, it actually activates the solenoid to give you the high beam output pattern. That's all that a Bi-Xenon controller does. This is where I like to actually spend my money, and I like to get something of good quality. And the reason for that, especially in a kit like this, is that you can go two different routes. So you can wire your harness with two separate relay harnesses, two separate controllers. And since you have 4 headlights, you can set it up almost like you're wiring up 2 cars, really. But if you buy a good quality relay harness, it is possible, and I've done it in the past, and you can check with the manufacturer, but it is possible that with those 35 watt kits, the harness should actually be able to support 2 ballasts on one side. So you can actually buy a splitter, and you can power 2 ballasts from one output on your harness. You only have to buy a single harness, and that really cuts down on the wiring, so nothing looks like a rat's nest under the hood. And those harnesses and those splitters are available from stores like the RETROFIT source. They have a huge selection of parts. You can contact them for exactly what you need. But the harness that you're looking for is a Bi-Xenon controller, and it's compatible with H4 or 9006 headlights. And like I said, you get a good quality one, and you get some splitters, and you can run 4 headlights off of a single Bi-Xenon controller harness. If you want to buy some cheap harnesses, that's your choice, but you may end up having to actually buy twice as many harnesses, and then, of course, almost wire it up like it's 2 separate vehicles. So after you finished wiring your headlights, it's now time to aim them. Now, the standard procedure for aiming your projector headlights is to park your vehicle 25 feet away from a wall, and it must be on a level surface. Now, on the wall, you can take your masking tape and you can run a horizontal level line across the wall, and it's going to be at the same height as your headlights are off the ground. Now, Fieros can range in the headlight height off the ground because likely if you've modified your headlights, you may have also modified your suspension and you may have lowered your vehicle. In my case, my car is pretty low in the front and my center of my headlights are about 23 inches off the ground, so my tape line would be 23 inches off the ground. Yours may vary a little bit. And so these headlights offer 2 different types of adjustment. There's the horizontal level, which can be adjusted simply by grabbing your projector by the shroud and twisting it inside of the bracket here. Now, we've tightened those back nuts down tight enough that the projector will not vibrate loose, but if you get a good grip on that shroud, you should be able to rotate it to adjust your horizontal level to get your cutoff line perfectly level with that piece of tape along the wall. Now, just be careful, because if you've been running your projector for a little while, they can get very hot, so you may want to wear some sort of a glove or protection on your hand to prevent yourself from getting burned. Try not to touch the metal housing or the lenses on the front. And now the second type of adjustment is the vertical adjustment, and that's where the adjustment screw at the back comes into play. It's very important at this stage that you have not tightened down any of these bolts too tight, because as I mentioned earlier in the video, you will be bending this bracket if you try to make adjustments to that screw with these bolts too tight. So they should be loose enough that you should be able to rotate your assembly by hand. And I've installed this little bubble level here at the top of my projector bracket to show you guys the effect of what happens when we turn that adjuster screw. So you're gonna need a long Phillips head screwdriver to get in there between the shrouds to the adjuster screw. And by rotating the screw clockwise, so the tightening direction, you're going to be pushing that screw forward and your lights should come up. And by loosening the screw in the counterclockwise direction, the opposite effect will take place and your lights will be adjusted down. And as part of the standard aiming procedure for these projector headlights, at a 25-foot distance away from the wall, the top edge of your cutoff line should be about 2 inches below the tape line that you made at the height of your actual headlights. And once you've achieved the desired level of your headlights, now you're gonna wanna come back to these bolts here and tighten them down. Also, as I mentioned earlier in the video, you're gonna wanna try and turn the head of the bolts and hold the nuts still so those serrations can cut into the plastic and keep these things from vibrating loose in the future. And in order to access the nuts on the other side, you're gonna have to raise your hood up to get a wrench on those. While you raise your hood up, keep in mind that this bracket still may be loose here. Now it should be trying to rotate downward still, and the adjuster foot should maintain contact with the back of the bucket so that you won't lose your alignment. And so just a tip for you guys running all 4 lights, I would actually only aim a single pair at a time. So disconnect the pair that you're not currently aiming. So for instance, you could start with the inner 2 headlights, disconnect the outer 2, get those lined up, and then do the opposite. Disconnect the inner 2 and align your outer 2. And the reason for doing this is that the 2 inner lights, you're gonna want to sort of line together, closer together. The outer 2 lights, you're also gonna wanna sort of aim those a little closer together. When you're looking at the cutoff patterns on the wall, it doesn't become confusing as to which light is which. And then at the end, you can turn all 4 lights on and make any minor adjustments to get everything just right. So now with everything secured down in place and your lights have been aimed on both sides of the vehicle, you can take your clear lens and you can just pop 2 machine screws in opposite corners into place and slip that on top of your assembly and push those in. So that's just gonna hold that in there in place so nothing moves on you. Next thing you're gonna wanna do is invest in some really good masking tape. Not like the junk that I have here. I gotta go pick some up, but we're currently in a pandemic, so I don't have any. What you're gonna do is on the outside of the lens, you're gonna take your masking tape and you're going to start marking off a pattern of which you're going to paint on the inside of the lens. So on the outside, what I'm doing here is I'm marking off this paint line that, like I said, I'm gonna follow on the inside. But by doing it on the outside first, you can essentially see where that paint line is gonna fall and the look that you're gonna go for the opening of your painted lens. And so now looking at the lens from the top, what I personally like to do is I like to draw my first line here across the top of the projectors, and I allow the shrouds to peek through just a little bit, and I try and take my leading edge here and line it up parallel with the edge of this headlight opening. So the lines of the vehicle are sort of maintained there. You get to see some of those nice projector shrouds on the inside, adds a little bit of interest to the look of the lights, and then from this line back, it'll get painted. So you can see here I've put down a few more tape lines. So this front edge, I've tried to maintain parallelism with the front edge of the headlight opening, as well as this back edge tape line that we just did. And this edge here, I've placed it far enough back that you can't see the seal on the inside or the flange, but not high enough that I'm gonna be obstructing the light output of my projectors. These lines here I've just sort of roughed into place. They're straight lines right now. And that gives me a pretty good idea again of where I need to put my tape line on the inside so that I can, again, not see the flanges and the seals. These corners right now are square. I'm gonna get creative with the hobby knife and I'm gonna run my tape laying on the inside. I don't need to do it on the outside yet, but on the inside, I can sort of radius these corners a little bit here to make things look a little bit prettier. You don't really want to have those straight edges. It just kind of looks amateur. So now when you get those tape lines where you want them, you can pop the lens off, and now you can look at the inside of the lens, and you can see the area that we've left open. This is the area now that we're gonna mask on the inside. So we're actually flipping it over now and doing the opposite on the inside. So I'm gonna run some masking tape along the inside, block this whole area off, and now, as I just mentioned, I can come in with a hobby knife and very carefully radius these corners here to sort of follow the radius of the lens itself. And I think that kind of looks pretty nice, keeps the lines all flowing together, and it'll give you a nice clean corner in there. And like I said, you're gonna wanna use some quality masking tape, especially for the inside. The outside is not actually quite as important because we're not gonna be spraying the outside. You are eventually gonna mask the entire outside so no overspray gets on the outside of the lens, but the inside is where you don't want those edges to bleed. You want nice, sharp, clean edges so your lens looks exceptionally professional. One other thing is that at this point, it's a good idea to put both lenses directly side by side and make sure that your tape lines look like exact mirror images of one another. They should be as accurate as you can possibly get them. And so if you've taken your time with this process, you should have been able to achieve a very professional looking finish here with nice, crisp mask lines. Now to get those lines really crisp, one other tip, I would actually remove the masking tape on the inside only, while the paint is still a little bit wet. Now, obviously you're gonna have to be very careful while doing this, not to touch the paint on the inside, but just to remove that while it's wet. And I believe that's gonna give you a much lesser chance of the paint tearing off with the masking tape than if you were to do it while the paint has been fully dried and cured. And so we are at the final stage here now where we can put our headlight lenses back on, grab 4 of these 832 flathead machine screws with the nylock locking nuts, and we're gonna use 4 of them to secure each lens into place. And so the last 2 pieces of advice here before finishing this last step, before you flip the hood up to access the nuts on the back side to tighten these things down, you're gonna wanna make sure the lens doesn't fall out when you lift your hood up. And so what you're gonna wanna do is you're going to want to slip a couple of those bolts into place, and that's just gonna provide enough friction to keep the lens from falling out when you flip the hood up. If you're still worried about that, you can take a little piece of masking tape or some other tape and just lightly tape the lens into place so it doesn't fall out when you lift the hood up. And the last thing here is that you do not need to over torque these screws. They're just clamping plastic together, and there's absolutely no reason you should be clamping them too hard. You're going to want to just achieve enough torque that if you take your hex key here and you go to spin this bolt without holding it on the other side, you should still be able to spin it a little bit, but there's a little bit of resistance. And that's only how tight you need to make these things. Do not crack the plastic. It's pretty resilient stuff, but still, there's really no reason at all to be going nuts with the torque. And now you're finally ready to sit back and enjoy your new headlights. And if you guys came across this video and you don't already own these lights and you're interested in purchasing them, be sure to visit the video description down below where I will put a link to my website where you can purchase these exact lights and find many other interesting things. Thanks again for watching, guys, and see you in the next video.